Hello, everyone. Welcome to the International Methods Colloquium. My name is Justin Esarey. I'm an I'm an associate professor, demoting myself, associate professor at Rice University. The International Methods Colloquium is a periodic online interactive seminar discussion on the application of quantitative statistical methodology to the social sciences, sponsored by Rice University and the National Science Foundation. And this week, I am very excited to host a roundtable discussion on the reproducibility crisis in social sciences, and in particular, to discuss a paper proposing a stricter threshold for statistical significance. As I mentioned, this discussion is motivated by a particular paper, Redefining Statistical Significance, which was recently published in Nature Human Behavior. And I will post a link to that paper and to the other papers that have been authored by our various panelists in your chat window once I get through with this little introductory bit. We are pleased to have 5 panel participants plus me. I've actually done a little work on this, so I want to be a part of it. I want to be a real boy too. These panelists are Daniel Benjamin. If you can go ahead and wave as I introduce you. Dan is associate research professor of economics at the University of Southern California, a primary co-author of the paper in Nature Human Behavior, and many other articles on inference and hypothesis testing in the social sciences. Daniel Lakens. Assistant professor in applied. Actually, you're an associate professor too, aren't you?
No, I'm not.
No, you're an assistant. Okay, I don't want to demote. I demoted myself already. Assistant professor in applied cognitive psychology in Eindhoven University of Technology, and an author or co-author on many articles in statistical inference in the social sciences, including the Open Science Collaboration's recent publication, science publication, estimating the reproducibility of psychological science. And perhaps most apposite to this particular conversation, Daniel is lead author of a preprint called Justify Your Alpha, a response to redefine statistical significance. Blake McShane, associate professor of marketing at Northwestern University and a co-author of the recent paper Abandon Statistical Significance, as well as many other articles on statistical inference and replicability. And he's sharing a chat window with Jennifer Tackett, associate professor of psychology at Northwestern University and co-author of the recent paper Abandon Statistical Significance, who specializes in childhood and adolescent psychopathology. I hope I got that right. I was doing the best I could reading your CV. And finally, E.J. Wagenmakers, professor of the methodology unit at the Department of Psychology at University of Amsterdam, a co-author of the paper Nature Human Behavior, and an author or co-author of many other articles concerning statistical inference in the social sciences, including a meta-analysis of the power pose effect. And there's me. I wrote a paper, response to redefine statistical significance for the Political Methodologist, which is the newsletter of our Political Methodology Society, called Lowering the Threshold of Statistical Significance to P less than 0.005 to encourage enriched theories of politics. I also recently published a paper called Does Peer Review Identify the Best Papers in PS, which is one of our big journals. And I've done some earlier work on statistical decision theory-based test for substantive significance. So that's everyone. I also noticed there's a little chat note that I should say. If you can't see all the speakers at once, you can actually change your view for those in the audience by clicking. There's a button that allows you to change how you view the participant. So you can choose to see just the active speaker, which means you'll just see me. Or you can choose to see all the speakers at once in a Brady Bunch style format. So if you can't see everyone, click around with your settings a little bit and you should be able to see everyone at once. I got a little question about that. I thought I would note that right away. Okay, so I'm going to give every member of the roundtable about 7 to 10 minutes to make a brief presentation, after which we're going to take questions from the audience. So Dan Benjamin, since you are one of the primary co-authors of the Nature paper, why don't you go ahead and get started?
Great, thank you. So let me share my screen. So our paper is motivated. Let me see. Our paper is motivated by the lack of reproducibility, concerns over the lack of reproducibility in the social sciences and more broadly, which has led to concern about the credibility of claims of new discoveries, which then subsequently replicated a lower rate than we might have expected. There's a number of causes of this lack of credibility of new discoveries. Probably the most important is multiple hypothesis testing. There's a number of issues and there's been some progress on addressing them. The point of our paper is to highlight another issue which hasn't gotten as much attention and we think is not as well understood, probably isn't as important as some of the other problems, but something that we think is a contributing factor, which is that p-values close to 0.05 constitute pretty weak evidence against the null hypothesis. So we propose to redefine the p-value threshold for statistical significance from 0.05 to 0.005 for novel discoveries. And if the p-value is in between 0.05 and 0.005, we advocate calling the result suggestive. We argue that would be a very simple step away from current practice that would immediately have some positive consequences. We think it would improve the way that evidence is interpreted and communicated, and it would improve the reproducibility of novel discoveries that are statistically significant. And I want to be clear that our proposal is really intended for research communities that stick with null hypothesis significance testing. Many of us agree with the abandoned statistical significance contingent that even better would be to move away from dichotomous evaluations of evidence altogether. But if we're going to be in this world of null hypothesis significance testing, we think that things will work better with a significance threshold of 0.005. So why do I say that p-values close to 0.05 are weak evidence? Well, from a Bayesian point of view, if we want to think about the strength of evidence against the null hypothesis, the tool we want to use is a Bayes factor. And what is a Bayes factor? Well, it's answering the question, if the observed data are what they are, what does that imply about the odds of the alternative hypothesis relative to the null? So using Bayes' rule, we can write the odds of the alternative relative to the null given the data that we have. That's called the posterior odds. That's going to be the product of two terms. One is the odds of what we observed given the alternative relative to the null. That's called the Bayes factor. And that's multiplied by the odds of the alternative relative to the null before we've seen any data at all. That's called the prior odds. Now, we want to focus on the evidence from the data. And so that's this term, the Bayes factor. That is the odds of having observed what we've seen given the alternative relative to the null. So what is this Bayes factor? Well, it's the PDF for the data under the alternative evaluated at the observed data divided by the PDF for the data under the null evaluated at what we observe. So one way we can visualize that in a simple case where we think of the data as being the sample mean. So here's a picture. The x-axis here is the sample mean, and the null hypothesis, which is the red curve, is centered at a population mean of 0. I've drawn an alternative hypothesis that's centered at a positive value for the population mean. That's the blue curve. And let's say that this dashed line is the observed sample mean. Well, then to calculate the Bayes factor, we would evaluate the PDF under the alternative, that's this point, and evaluate the PDF under the null, that's this point, and take their ratio. So the blue height divided by the red height, that's the Bayes factor. That tells us the relative likelihood of the data under the alternative relative to the null. So now what we'd like to do is say, what does a given p-value, like a p-value of 0.05, imply about the Bayes factor? Unfortunately, in general, we can't answer that question because calculating a p-value requires just that you specify the null hypothesis but the Bayes factor requires specifying both the null and the alternative hypothesis, and we often don't specify what the alternative hypothesis is. But what we can do is get a bound, an upper bound, on the Bayes factor under pretty general assumptions about the alternative hypothesis. So let me give an example. So again, we'll consider the data, the relevant x, to be the sample mean, and we'll say it's drawn from a normal distribution with population mean theta and variance 1. Our null hypothesis is that the population mean is 0. Now, if we consider a one-sided test, because it'll make the argument simpler, then every p-value has a one-to-one correspondence with a particular realization of the sample mean. So some given p-value of 0.05 is going to correspond to some sample mean. And then if we want to get give the best shot we can to the alternative hypothesis, then we can set the population mean under the alternative equal to the sample mean. Of course, that's cheating because we're using the data to tell us what the alternative is, but it's going to give us an upper bound on the Bayes factor, so the maximum evidence against the null hypothesis. So here's what that looks like graphically. The x-axis, again, is the sample mean. Under the null, the population mean is 0. For a one-sided test, a p-value of 0.05 corresponds to a sample mean of 1.645. So this is the upper 5% tail of the distribution under the null. And now let's ask, what amount of evidence does that correspond to? Well, we can draw an alternative hypothesis that's centered at that value. So that gives the alternative the best shot it can. And then take the ratio of the height of the PDF of the alternative relative to the null at that point, and it's 3.9. So at best, a result that has a p-value of 0.05 in a one-sided test is giving you 3.9 to 1 evidence of the alternative in favor relative to the null. Now that's for a one-sided test. In the paper, the diagram we show is for a two-sided test, and we calculate it for a range of p-values. So let me just explain this figure. The x-axis here is a range of p-values. Here's 0.05, here's 0.005. The y-axis is the Bayes factor, or the upper bound on the Bayes factor on a log scale. There are 4 curves here. They correspond to different sets of assumptions we could make about the alternative hypothesis for calculating the upper bound on the Bayes factor. The black curve is the absolute upper bound that comes from the kind of argument I just described. The others are calculated under different assumptions. And what you can see is that for a p-value of 0.05, the calculations of the upper bound range from 2.4 to 3.4. So about 3 to 1 evidence against the null hypothesis, which we argue is pretty weak. And if significant results are going to be considered to have been established, that's not a criterion that we want. That 3 to 1 really should be thought of as more like suggestive evidence. If you look instead at a p-value of 0.005, that corresponds to a range of 13.9 to 25.7, which is more like 20 to 1, which we argue is more what we think scientists have in mind what they think that what they're thinking of when they describe something as significant evidence. So let me, given my limited amount of time, let me stop there.
All right. Thank you very much, Dan. Do you want to unshare your screen so we get back to the...
Sure. Let me figure out how to do that. Stop share.
There we go. Okay. So next, I think we'll go to Blake and Jennifer. The authors of the...
Did EJ want to follow on from Daniel?
Oh, EJ, do you want to...
Well, yeah, I think my presentation continues where Dan left off. So I think it makes more sense if I take over now. So
go ahead. That sounds good to me.
Okay. Oh, wait, share screen, right? here we go. Does this work?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, great. So, I'm basically going to argue the same thing as Dan, but what I'll do is, I'll discuss a bit more about the strength of evidence coming from a base factor and what it means, and then I'll give a concrete example about a result with a p-value just below 0.05. So if you want to read about my opinions, we are up to, I think, 10 blog posts on this issue on Bayesian spectacles. These are blog posts together with my student Quinten Gronau. Okay, so first let's discuss the strength of evidence coming from a base factor, because the argument was base factors of 3, perhaps they aren't worth much, right? But what is a base factor of 3 exactly? How should we interpret it? So I have a cartoon to explain that. So this is an interpretation of the strength of evidence from a base factor. So suppose we have a base factor of 3 in favor of the alternative hypothesis. So the observed data are 3 times more likely to have occurred under the alternative than under the null. So we can represent that with the 3 blue balloons and the 1 yellow balloon. And then assuming that the hypotheses are equally likely a priori, we can transform that base factor to a proportion. So that gives us 75% for the alternative and 25% for the null. So we can then create a probability wheel or a pizza plot where 75% of the area is covered, occupied by the alternative and 25% by the null. Now then, imagine that this wizard attaches a spinner to this pizza plot in the middle and then spins the spinner. And the spinner actually ends up pointing to the smaller area. How surprised are you? Well, in this case, you would be a little surprised, but you wouldn't be very surprised, and you would certainly not be surprised enough to write a paper about it and issue a strong claim. So your level of imagined surprise at this spinner pointing to the smaller area quantifies your intuition for the strength of evidence that a base factor provides. And so one of the points of this paper, Redefining Statistical Significance, is that when we base decisions on p-values just below 0.05, they are about as compelling or sometimes less compelling as the one that I just showed you. So this particular plot, which is, not a lot of evidence. So let's just make that concrete. So I'll demonstrate this with an example, and I analyzed it using the program JASP that we have developed here at the University of Amsterdam. So this is what JASP, this is the screenshot from our website, so you can download JASP for free, and it allows you to do both classical analyses and Bayesian analyses very easily. But I'll just show you some of the output here today. So I took a specific study. I could have taken any study. I just took this one because I recently came across it, and it was published in The Lancet, which is one of the most prestigious medical journals. So they did 2 experiments. One was the key experiment. The other one wasn't so important, but I'll discuss that result nonetheless. They had 13 participants with post-traumatic stress disorder. And these people indicated how much stress they perceived, and at the same time, their amygdalar activity was measured. And the authors had the hypothesis that people with higher amygdala activity should perceive more stress. So this result, so you see that this is a plot taken from the journal. You can see that the Pearson correlation is 0.56 and the p-value is 0.0485. So we declare statistical significance and we reject the null hypothesis. Right? Now let's reanalyze these data in JASP. So we actually, of course, you can get the data from this figure using some software and you can analyze it that way, but JASP also has a summary stats module that allows you to just take the number of subjects and this particular correlation, 0.56, and you input those two values and you get a complete comprehensive Bayesian analysis. And when we execute that Bayesian analysis using our default priors, we get this result. So the dotted line is our default prior, and I'll change that later on, but the dotted line is our default prior. The solid line is our posterior distribution. And you can see that the base factor here is about 2. And you can see that from what that means in terms of the pizza plot, right? So how surprised are you if that spinner would end up pointing to the white area in the pizza plot? You wouldn't be terribly surprised at all, and you certainly wouldn't feel confident in rejecting the null hypothesis based on this evidence. Now, of course, you can argue perhaps this prior distribution is too vague, right? But the point of the paper, and I think this has been almost always overlooked, the point of the paper is not that this particular base factor is not compelling. The point is, no matter how you tinker with this prior distribution, it will never be compelling. So to show you, also in JASP, you can just tick a box that says robustness analysis, and that gives us this figure. So on the x-axis, you see a scaling that basically makes that prior distribution that was wide and flat to begin with, it basically creates a continuous range of prior distributions that change from all the way peaked to very flat. And you can see that no matter what you do to this prior distribution, the evidence will never be more compelling than, in this case, 2.3. And so what we did in our paper is report upper bounds like this. So the usual critique that people have against Bayes factors, they depend on the prior distribution and how do we select the prior distribution. They kind of don't really apply because we use an upper bound argument. And so if you want to argue against the Bayes factors that we propose, you need to argue not against, the general critique against Bayes factors doesn't suffice. You need to argue against the upper bound argument. So this figure, for instance, shows that no matter what you do, the evidence will never be compelling, and it's less strong than I showed you in the wizard comic, right? And that's a problem. I think that a better way to present these data is not just tell people P is smaller than 0.05, reject the null, but in addition, you could actually show figures like this. And in the paper, we argued that an easy way to become more strict is to adopt this different threshold. I think many of the authors on the paper actually would take more drastic measures, but we live in you have to take into account the constraints of reality. So, but the bottom line is that the alpha level of 0.05 is just too lenient, meaning that if you're p-values of 0.049 really don't mean very much in terms of evidence, and we should be aware of this. So I think we should be careful about p-values just below 0.05. P-values ignore what is expected under the alternative hypothesis, as Dan already explained, and that way they lead to an overestimation of the evidence against the null. So when we want to issue bold claims like reject the null, you need strong evidence, and the 0.05 level simply doesn't allow you to do that. And in addition, of course, I would encourage everybody to give JASP a shot. It allows a friendly, informative, and comprehensive assessment of evidence. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, great. Just one quick note for those watching, there is a Q&A box that's different from the webinar chat box. So we will get to Q&A after everyone's had a chance to talk a little bit at the beginning, but you can start asking questions in the Q&A box right now, and they will sort of pile up there and we'll get to them at the end. Blake and Jennifer, do you want to go ahead and go now?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
All right, so thanks very much. I guess responding to EJ's point about more drastic measures, I think that's where we come in. We don't believe there are any quick fixes, whether that's keeping alpha at 0.05 as is current practice, whether it's setting alpha to 0.005 as Daniel B. and EJ and their 70 co-authors recommend, or choosing your own alpha adventure as Daniel L. and his 83 co-authors recommend. Instead, what we recommend is entirely abandoning the outmoded null hypothesis significance testing paradigm and the p-value thresholds that are intrinsic to it as the default statistical paradigm in the biomedical and social sciences. To be clear, and I think this is a point of confusion that has come up, we are not saying to ban p-values, not at all. What we are saying is rather than allowing statistical significance as determined by p less than 0.05 or some other statistical threshold, to serve as a sort of lexicographic decision rule, the p-value should be demoted from its threshold screening role and instead be treated continuously and treated as one among many sources of evidence. And we do this really for three primary reasons. First and foremost, the sharp point null hypothesis of zero effect and zero systematic error that's used in the overwhelming majority of applications in the biomedical and social sciences is generally not of interest because it's simply implausible. In general, effects are small and they vary from person to person, from situation to situation. So this is rejecting this straw man null hypothesis is not of interest. And in general, further, even if were an effect truly zero, say ESP, it absolutely strains credulity to believe that one could design an experiment free from any source of bias such that the effect captured in your particular study would actually be zero. Second, the standard use of significance testing to take the rejection of this straw man null as positive or even definitive evidence in favor of some pet alternative hypothesis is a logical fallacy that leads even experienced scientists and expert statisticians to commit erroneous reasoning. In other words, people take p less than 0.05 to mean true and p greater than 0.05 to be false. Third, p-value thresholds and other statistical thresholds encourage researchers to sort of pick out single comparisons rather than focusing on the totality of their results. And we'd like to see people sort of examine all of their data and present all of their results. We view statistical thresholds, whether by p-value, whether by confidence interval, whether by Bayes factor or what have you, as a form of statistical alchemy that falsely promises to transmute randomness into certainty. It's lovely, but it's optimistic. It's an uncertainty laundering that begins with data and concludes with dichotomous declarations of truth and falsity, binary statements about there being an effect or there being no effect, based on some statistical threshold being surpassed. We think a critical step forward is to begin accepting uncertainty and embracing variation in effects and recognizing that we can learn much. In fact, I think indeed much more about the world by forsaking the false promise of certainty offered by dichotomization based on thresholds. Jennifer?
Right, so to just reiterate what Blake said and really underscore the point, in our paper, we explicitly do not call for abandoning p-values. This has been a common misinterpretation of what we wrote. Rather, we're calling for abandonment of the arbitrary thresholds that are placed on them. And another thing we really wanted to do in our paper was to start thinking through the implications of this if we actually were to abandon these thresholds and consider practical solutions if we were able to get to that point. So in the paper, we offer a list of critical pieces of evidence, and we refer to these as the neglected factors that we think should be systematically and explicitly evaluated alongside continuous p-value information. And there may be other factors that can be added to the list, but the factors that we noted include prior and related evidence, plausibility of mechanism, study design and data quality, real-world costs and benefits, novelty of the finding, and of course, there will also be factors that vary by research domain. In terms of how these neglected factors can be implemented in practice, we don't think that this is unrealistic or impractical at all, and we think there are a lot of easy opportunities to do so. The examples that we note in the paper include doing this at both the editorial and reviewing stage, as well as the stage of authors actually interpreting and writing up their findings. So specifically, it's easy to imagine explicit and systematic consideration of each of these factors that could even be added into sort of standard reviewer protocols, something that reviewers have to go through point by point. Similarly, editors could add a template to their decision letters that explicitly consider each of these factors in light of a given study or paper. And authors could also include a section in their general discussion where they go through each factor in turn, weighing the evidence from their particular study in this context, and then ultimately providing a holistic summary of all the available evidence in interpreting their study results.
So in sum, we're not looking for a quick fix or a dam to contain the flood, as Dan B. and EJ's co-author John Ioannidis put it. Rather, we're suggesting an overhaul of an outmoded statistical paradigm and a broken system. Thank you.
Dan Lakens, you want to take off from there?
Sure. Well, maybe I'm just completely convinced by now. I mean, these are just such good arguments. So these p-values are indeed pretty low evidence if they're 0.05. That's definitely true. There's no way to contest that. And it's also true that people are using mindless statistics, like thinking yes or no after a p-value is below 0.05 or above. And both these things are probably wrong. Now, I think that in thinking about how we should improve things, because that's definitely necessary. And I think everybody here is sort of fed up with this mindless use of 0.05 at this threshold. That's really, really problematic. I think if we are specifically focused on improving the reproducibility of science, then we really carefully need to think what real researchers need to do to get there. Now, lowering this significance threshold is not really a good solution. At least that's what all the authors on our paper thought. Just very briefly, the main reasons for this is, first of all, there's actually not a lot of evidence that this thing is going to work in itself. If you want to propose a new solution, I think that's perfect. But I'm not really sure that lowering the significance threshold specifically to this 0.005 value is really going to do it. We don't know. So rolling this out widespread is just a bit premature. The second thing is that the justifications for this specific threshold are not very good. So why would you specify this specific value if you don't really know or don't have strong arguments for it? And the third thing is that you should carefully weigh the costs and the benefits of introducing something new. I think Dan mentioned, replicability might become better. That's probably true, but there are also negative consequences of introducing anything new. So these need to be carefully weighed and discussed before you can actually introduce something. Now, if we want to use the momentum that you have in science, because people are pretty well aware that there's a problem, if you want to use this momentum to make a change, well, I would say that what you don't want to do is to introduce another mindless default. Now, that's not going to make anything much better. So I also think that if you want to use an alpha level, and we can discuss how often and under which research questions this is actually an interesting thing to do. Now, I don't think, very often statisticians say, this is not what you want to know. But as a researcher, I'm pretty well aware of what I actually want to know. And if I want to use a null hypothesis test, then I probably have a very good reason for it. That's not saying that everybody always has a good reason, but I think we should not abandon a tool. Sometimes that's actually the question that you want to ask. So if you want to use this tool, then I don't think there can be a lot of discussion that what we propose in our paper, justifying your alpha level, is the right thing to do. Now, maybe if you didn't pay a lot of attention in intro stats and your stats teacher didn't really explain that this is actually how you should use an alpha level, then you can reread Neyman, who basically says that it should be left up to the researcher where this threshold should be put. Now, we don't do this. And I know that we don't do this, but we should do this. So this is really, if you want to use an alpha level, the only correct way to do it is just to justify your alpha level. There cannot be a lot of discussion about this. How you have to justify it does not have to do anything with evidence. We saw a lot of talk about Bayes factors. The alpha level is the maximum probability that you'll make an error if you draw an inference. It's error control, and that's really the main goal of using an alpha level. Now, any sort of justification based on evidence is misplaced thinking that p-values are a good proxy of evidence, and they're not. I don't understand why statisticians keep talking about this. P-values are not good. If you want evidence, use a tool that provides evidence. Don't use p-values as proxies. I think the only real discussion is maybe, can people do this? Right? So we say, do this thing, justify your alpha level, think carefully about what question you're actually asking and whether null hypothesis testing is an answer to your question. I think that's really the discussion we should be having. Do we trust people well enough? And are we giving people the right tools to do this? Because I think that's really what the problem comes down to.
All right. Thanks, Daniel. I'm also going to say a little bit before we get to the Q&A. I've been thinking about this question for a while, but particularly as it pertains to political science, because I'm a political scientist. It is very hard to disagree that the null hypothesis testing procedure that dominates certainly the social sciences has caused some issues. We measured, a graduate student of mine and I measured, assuming no p-hacking, no sort of everyone sort of doing exactly what they ought to be doing, the procedure of the 0.05 NHST would sort of, we measured about 20 to 30% average upward bias in the magnitude of results in the political science literature using a bunch of papers that we collected, with about 50 to 75% of studies having bias of 10% or more. So without getting into the methodology, we essentially analyzed a bunch of published work and then tried to determine how biased they would be based on certain assumptions about the process. And of course, the reproducibility studies that have gotten a lot of press have really made it clear that the 5% threshold is not doing a great job of filtering out null results. Right, there are plenty of null results that still, there may not be such a thing as a null of exactly zero. We could debate that at length, but there are certainly effects that don't matter, and quite a few effects that don't matter are pretty close to zero, or are substantively meaningless, seem to have gotten through that filter, and that's a big problem. On the other hand, the NHST is sort of on a Pareto frontier of things we can do, and what I mean by that is it's hard to think of a change to that process that doesn't involve costs as well as benefits. If there was something that we could do that everyone would agree is universally an improvement and had no negative consequences, we'd probably already be doing it. And what this the upshot of this is a conversation like this one has been going on since the 50s, maybe, depending on exactly what literature you're looking at. It's never gone anywhere. You can read. I think psychology is probably the most fecund discipline for this. You can read people saying stuff in the 1970s that's pretty damning, and it just never goes anywhere. And the conversation keeps coming up over and over again, and no changes ever get made. And to me, that is a social fact that is worth noting in and of itself. And I don't think it's one that's easily ascribable to, people are dumb or something like that. There has to be some reason why it's not really taking off. And I think part of that is because anything that we can propose as an alternative, we can criticize. And some of those criticisms are going to be pretty good. And so we basically we're stuck at this, basically, Fisher and Neyman decided on a certain thing we were going to do. And it was pretty close to a Pareto frontier, and nobody can get off of that point because any move off of that point improves in some ways and doesn't improve in others. And so we're just stuck. So what does all that mean? Well, one thing I didn't want to happen with this conversation was it to become, with apologies to the marketing professor on the panel, I didn't want it to become a marketing thing where we all marketed our own ideas. I had my own ideas. You can check out my website. I just think that's bound to kind of fail. Like, you're going to pick it apart. There's going to be problems with it. I could pick your stuff apart. There's going to be problems with that too. I didn't want to get into that because I feel like in the literature I've seen that before and it never works out. So then what? Okay, given that, what do we do instead? How do we deal with this? And I'm kind of thinking, my current thinking is maybe what we need is a little more diversity in the marketplace. And what I mean by that is right now, virtually every journal, every quantitative journal applies the same standard or a very similar standard in the sense that the NHST is a gate. It's not, of course, it's never, I think this day and age, it's never the only criterion, but it's a necessary criterion for publication. But I don't see any reason why all journals have to treat evidence all in the same way. And, earlier, it's been mentioned that there's not a lot of evidence, for example, that lowering the threshold to 0.005 will make good things happen. There is tons of evidence that a threshold of 0.05 does make some bad things happen. The problem is we actually don't have a lot of evidence on what any of these reforms will do once they, anyone who's studied policy at all knows once a plan hits the world, all kinds of things happen that you didn't anticipate. So that suggests to me that what we need is some data, right? What we need is a bunch of journals to do these things, so they're not all to do the same thing, and to see what happens as a result of that. And I don't know exactly what that looks like. I know there have been some journals in psychology that have basically banned p-values for a certain time. Then the editor changed and they unbanned them, I think. That's a little bit one-off to be systematic. I think we could probably be a little more systematic about the process. But at this point, what I really want to avoid is no change, right? We have this conversation, we all get tenure or whatever, we all do some interviews, and then all of our students are still doing exactly the stuff they were doing before. That's deeply frustrating to me. So what I'm mostly interested in coming out of this is some plan that's not that, right? And that's also not do my thing because I'm the best, right? Because I think I'm the best, but we all think that. So, okay, so
sorry, we stopped hearing you, Justin.
Oh, I turned off that was dumb. I turned off my microphone thinking, I'm done. I should turn off my microphone, but I'm actually not done. Dumb. Okay, so I'm just going to go through, we have some questions in the Q&A box. I'm just going to start asking some questions and I will open them up to the audience. So Arnold Lau asks, plenty of people are mistakenly attracted to quantitative studies because of the illusion of certainty that misinterpreting p less than 0.05 provides. Is it fair to say that adopting and abandoning a statistical significance approach would make quantitative studies look more like qualitative studies, which take a more holistic and humble approach to considering evidence and making arguments? I do not think this is a bad thing, by the way.
Sure, I can respond to that. I think, sorry, I'm echo. Okay. I think this is something that's actually happening already in a lot of areas of psychological research. And if we think back to sort of the classic construct validation framework that, Cronbach and Miel were talking about decades and decades ago, the idea of construct validation is essentially the sort of holistic summary of all available evidence without requiring on a single piece. So the idea itself isn't new, and I don't think it's inherently qualitative either. I think there's a way to systematically weigh quantitative evidence, but to be more comprehensive and holistic in the way we do that.
Does anyone else want to follow up with that?
I'd just like to say that I completely agree that people are allergic to uncertainty, and I think that's part of the attraction of this dichotomous nature, right? People would love to be able to say, this is now proven. Let's stop discussing whether this is a fact or not. I've shown you it exists. P is smaller than whatever value. And that will always remain a problem. I think regardless of what you do, people will have a natural drive to sort of ignore uncertainty. So that's anything we can do to bring that uncertainty into the light would be a good idea. And I certainly believe we should be more humble.
I want to ask a question that somebody, Mike Frank, asked that I think is very practical and certainly on my mind as a teacher. Asking in part on behalf of my students in my class, some of whom are watching. Thanks for having this webinar. Imagine there is a graduate student running a labor-intensive and expensive school-based intervention study with a strong design. They have pre-registered their intention to test the difference between intervention and control groups using a standard two-sample t-test. They see P of 0.01. What is the recommendation to this graduate student given the current publication climate and heterogeneous opinions on statistical inference? Should the student attempt to publish but describe the results as suggestive? Should they wait a year and replicate? Should they report the BF along with the p-value? And then a broader backdrop at the policy level, I understand the concerns being discussed, but I often have trouble translating this set of policy ideas into concrete recommendations. I think that's a really interesting question. I can tell you what I would do. I would tell your student to write up the results exactly as they are and send them to a journal and let them decide how conclusive they are. And in other words, I would express the degree of conclusiveness that I think is justified given the evidence in the text, and then let the reviewers decide whether they decide they want to impose some greater standard. And if they do, they're going to have to defend that and justify that and explain why the evidence is sort of not sufficient. But I'm sure you guys have thoughts about that.
Yeah, I'll say what I would do is, whether I would calculate Bayes factors or do some more fully Bayesian analysis, I think that's going to depend on the context and whether it's, the norms of the field, and whether I think there's something more I could learn by doing those additional analyses. But at a minimum, I would describe a result that had a p-value of 0.001 as suggestive, because I think that is really a more accurate description of the strength of the evidence than calling it significant, which conveys a greater certainty in the result than I think is really justified. And so my intention going forward is to make sure that I reserve, if I'm going to use the word significant, I'm actually going to try to not use the word significant at all. But I'm certainly not going to use it for results that don't pass the 0.005 threshold.
I'd also like to see this hypothetical student running this expensive school intervention talk about some of these neglected factors we're talking about. How was this study designed? Was it a reasonable study? What are this p-value of 0.01? Great. Well, what were the effects on the outcomes of interest? Whether this is achievement, whether this is college attendance, college graduation rates, whether it's follow-up employment 10 years later. Let's actually see this quantified in terms of both the quality of the study design. What are these real world? We're doing a policy experiment here. Let's see sort of real world benefits quantified. And then let's also have discussion of, which I think is often lost in these ideas, is it actually possible to roll this thing out on a large scale basis, and how would we do it? So I think there's a lot of opportunity. This is a nice example where these neglected factors come into play. It's a very concrete situation.
There's a question that came in that I think is the other side of this question. And Steve Haptenstall asked this, and I was thinking very much the same thing. Embracing uncertainty is a luxury often not available to those making binary decisions based on results. I'm happy to explain some nuance, but in the end, I need to make a one-handed economist recommendation. JASP seems to take a good approach by showing a distribution of Bayes factors. What alternative is there, given that I'm happy to man in 0.05? And I'll just add on to that. Journal editors need to make one-handed decisions. You can't partially accept a paper. As a teacher, I need to make essentially one-handed decisions about whether I'm going to talk about something and how I'm. I can talk about it as more or less certain, but some things that I can't share the fire hose of results that's coming out of science every day. So there are a lot of one-handed, there are a lot of one-handed decisions we have to make. How do we make those? And I am not saying 0.05 as a threshold is a great way to do that, but if we're not going to do that, how are we going to do that?
I think that's a really good point, because even if you're a researcher, you have to decide whether you want to do a study or you will not do a study. So many things that we do are dichotomous. I don't think you want to immediately go to a policy implementation based on a single study. We should have,
right.
A replication is really nice before we're going to roll out something. But very often you have to make dichotomous choices. Now, I think there is some agreement more people have mentioned it, that the cost-benefit analysis is really what we want. We want to be able to say, what is the amount of risk that I'm willing to take that I'll make an error if I go forward treating this as something that exists or not? What are the costs and what are the possible benefits? And then this trade-off, well, there's not a lot of guidance on how to set it, but there's some very nice papers that make suggestions on when an error is okay or not. In our paper, we cite one publication that does this calculation for the decline in koala bears in Australia, where they want to keep track of the decline in koala bears. If they make an error in that sense, it's hugely costly. So basically, they set the alpha level to 1. They cannot make an error. So the alpha is 1. You don't actually have to test it. You can immediately go on and treat it as if it's declining. But for other species, this trade-off is somewhere else. But it's never really at an alpha level of 0.05. It might be higher, it might be lower. But this is, I think, a good approach, trying to think of a cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah, I think that we have to distinguish between the separate ingredients in the decision-making process. So on the one hand, there's the evidence. There's also the prior plausibility of the hypotheses, and then there's the utilities. And I think that if you're interested in making a decision, and honestly, in my work, I'm perfectly okay with seeing graded evidence, and I don't feel the need to make hard decisions. But okay, if you want to make hard decisions, then you need to specify these utilities and combine them with the evidence you have, unless you already know from your utilities that it doesn't matter what the evidence says, and you'll go with one option anyway. But I honestly don't think that researchers who make a claim about accepting or rejecting a null hypothesis really feel that they're making a decision at that point. I think they're expressing a certainty, a kind of belief, but that's pure speculation, of course.
I'll just say, please go ahead.
Oh, just also to add on to that. So one of the decisions, dichotomous decisions you referenced was, editorial decisions, right? And this is something we talked about quite a bit. And I think it's a good example because, editors and reviewers are already essentially making these sort of holistic judgments. They're just not doing it in a systematic or explicit way. And the sort of undue influence of p less than 0.05 is clearly problematic in this process, but we're already doing this. I mean, editors are technically taking lots of pieces of information together to make a final decision, right? So we're just arguing for doing that more comprehensively and more systematically.
And without screening.
Right. And I think this ties into EJ's point, right? Because the extent to which people use p less than 0.05, it kind of overshadows everything else and clouds any sort of thoughtful, comprehensive reasoning. So I think I definitely agree with what EJ's saying.
I just want to kick in one thing. Often the answer is statistical decision theory, right? Somebody says something like that. I agree with that. I wrote a paper with one of my old graduate students, Nathan Danneman, who's now a consultant, or government contractor. I forget. He works for a consulting firm. Anyway, where we basically tried to automate the process of statistical decision-based, theory-based inference, right? And we had a utility function that made sense and blah, 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 and we made a little package. And then we put it out in the world, and like so many other things, it kind of like, it's a shrug, whatever, fine. And then, people went on using the same thing they were using before. And of course, there's partly like, why didn't you like my baby? But there's also part of it like, well, surely somebody could have come up in all these 50 years with some sort of, if that were a really good answer, something would have been, some version of this would have been seized upon. And there seems to be, for whatever reason, among consumers and users of statistical methods, an aversion to doing this. And like EJ with his JASP program, we tried to make it so that the shape of the utility function was more of an upper bound than we are saying what the right utility function is. But even that, people just, you say utility function or loss function, they just, nope, that seems it's like saying prior, right? Some people just turn off right then. And so for, that may well be the answer, but it doesn't go down easily. I can tell you from experience.
But I think, I think that's the case for all the things that have been recommended so far. So we are saying that people should move away from something that's pretty easy because it's mindless, but we're not giving them a lot of tools and education and training how to do this. And I was looking at the Q&A and everybody's like, so how does this more comprehensive analysis of results actually work? Mm-hmm. Well, people are trying to learn different approaches to Bayesian statistics. The same goes for statistical decision theory. It might actually be the best solution to the problem that we have. But then it also requires people to sit together before they design the experiment and think through all the steps that are required. Now, maybe the popularity of pre-registered reports will make this a little bit easier to do, because maybe journals will say, hey, you have to consider this in advance as well. But we have to have some way to get there, not just say that it's the better thing to do, but help guide people along to actually reach this.
There's one question that's come up quite a lot in the Q&A that I want to make sure we get to before we finish. And I could have picked several, but I'll just pick one right here from Nick Jackson. I was wondering if any of the panelists have considered more broadly how it is that we incentivize researchers to find statistical significance, which leads to practices like p-hacking and the garden at forking paths and so on. Does anyone have any thoughts regarding how it is we change the incentive side of the problem? To be clear, I'm thinking about how it is that we need to find p less than 0.05 to publish and to get funding and so on. I'm wondering if we are just going to recreate the same problem of non-replicable research with whatever procedure it is we substitute in.
Yeah, so I think this is a much bigger problem really than the statistical issues that we've been discussing. So really it's kind of it's remarkable that you have somebody who has a particular theory, who has published about this theory. This person designs an experiment, collects the data. This often takes months. Now there's data, and it is clear that when the data are analyzed and p is smaller than 0.05, this means success. If it's larger than 0.05, it means failure. And now, who will we let analyze the data, right? Who is most probably the most biased person to analyze this data, right? That's the very person who set up the experiment. And not only do we let this person analyze the data, but often this person doesn't need to share the data, doesn't even need to share the analysis code. I think in any other profession, that would be considered a really serious problem. And so I think we need to move towards a model where we need to be much more transparent about our analyses, alternative analyses that were conducted on the data. So that's a major problem, and it may actually overshadow everything else.
I was talking to someone about this the other day. I haven't met a lot of comic book villains in my profession, meaning people will go like, and then I faked the data, I consciously, tried to deceive people. So on the one hand, I don't believe that the at least political science, and I doubt other disciplines, are populated with rogues. On the other hand, to quote Richard Feynman, the easiest person to fool is yourself. I think it can be relatively easy to do things which make sense because they go along with your incentives, and they're not explicit attempts to deceive, but they end up in bad directions. And I think a good counter to that is, like EJ just said, make all the data and replication code available so that if there are alternative ways of looking at it, those will get out there. I do think we need to think about how it is we handle cases where these things have been discovered. It's funny. I think on the one hand, people have complained about sort of being too hard on those people whose studies have turned out to be non-replicable. And I kind of agree with that. But the flip side of that coin is often before they were found to be non-replicable, the people who did these studies benefited a lot from them, right? They got so much attention, they rose so high because of them. And so my view is, I don't think we should be, burning witches or something as a means of, exercising our collective ghosts. But on the other hand, why are we putting all this value and all this? Why do we have a science where we think of heroes and villains? Right? That I don't agree with there being villains. I also don't usually agree with there being heroes. I certainly don't think that any one or two papers is particularly dispositive of anything. So the idea that someone gets a ton of TED Talks or something because they wrote a paper that was kind of interesting is just crazy to me. And I say that as someone who's partially benefited from that, right? I wrote a couple of papers and they're kind of interesting and they get picked up and people talk about them. That's fine, but maybe we should try to move away from that and try to think more about body of research than about any one paper.
I think that sounds really nice. At the same time, there's a lot of stuff hinging on single publications for people. So that, of course, it creates an incentive for people to fool themselves. So if anything that we want to do that prevents this in the future, then it means that we actually should stop giving people really easy, mindless things to do, like news thresholds. I think that's really one of the things that is not going to move things forward.
Your microphone turned off.
Making people think about these things and removing them a little bit from the data analysis, that can be very useful, right? And then we can train people, have people who are more experienced in data analysis and guide them through this process. I also think that the other side is true. So the people who are guiding these people through the process don't have all the answers because a lot of the questions have just not been asked. Like, how do we do this in practice? That's going to be much more difficult than I think people now think. It seems like, yeah, you can do this or this and this, and it's going to be so easy. But if you're going to sit down and do it for all different research areas, and there's so much diversity in science that we're not really representing here, but there's so many different questions people are asking, it's going to be much more difficult for all sides involved.
So we're out of time, but I want to end with a question that I'm actually not going to ask us to answer because I don't think there's a good answer to it, but it's a question we should be thinking about. And an anonymous attendee said this. I think that's good that they were anonymous. What will happen when reviewer 1 tells me to remove the p-values? Reviewer 2 says reject because p is not less than 0.005. And reviewer 3 asks for a whole big report about all the different missing information like Blake and Jennifer were suggesting. How's the editor going to collate that information? I think that's an excellent question. I have no idea how they're going to deal with that. And I think that's part of what we are going to need to figure out over time. So that's where I try to end pretty promptly at noon. I want to thank all of our panelists today for being a part of this discussion. I want to also advertise next week, Friday and November 3rd. We are scheduled to host Will Hobbs, a postdoctoral fellow at Northwestern University's Network Science Institute. You can visit our website, www.methods-colloquium.com, for more details on that presentation. And also on our schedule of future presentations, we have a whole slate of future presentations the rest of this fall and also in the spring. We also have archived recordings of all of our previous presentations, and this one will be posted probably a little later tonight. Thanks to everyone. I had a great time, and I hope that we have made some progress toward thinking about how to revise our statistical inference procedures.
Thanks, Justin.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. See you all next time.
Thank you.